Hi everyone, my name's Corel, and today we're going to be taking a look at one of the most finesse-based and finicky traps in the game to use. Recently introduced in the Dreadshore content drop at a moderate 50 capacity, the Sentry Beam is currently the only surface mount trap in the game with a targeting arc, meaning it can target the raider within a roughly 140-degree cone in front of it, extending out to 6 blocks in range. Once the Sentry targets a raider, it'll begin its 3-phase firing cycle. In the tracking phase, it'll draw an indicator of the beam's intended path. Then it'll begin tracking the raider for 3 seconds, slowly rotating to aim towards them, before it enters the charging phase. In the charging phase, the beam's aim is locked in place for about 3/4 of a second, and the indicator will begin flashing. And then finally, the Sentry will fire a red laser beam along that path that the indicator chose, and that will last about 2.5 seconds and travel up to 25 blocks in length, and it will bounce off of up to 2 surfaces. The third surface it strikes, however, will dissipate the beam and it will not go any further. This beam will instantly kill anything it touches. That includes raiders, guards, and traps along its path. The path of the beam is of course very visible to the raider in both charging phases, and of course the giant red laser beam as it's firing is a pretty good indicator of death. So yeah, very visible to the raider, and that long charging time makes it very obvious what's about to happen. Now, the laser beams cannot be deflected with Fury's Edge, but they can be countered with the Arc Barrier and Flash Barrier. Now, the Arc Barrier in particular often reflects the beam exactly back in the direction it came from, so if the raider can choose to be struck by the beam before it's taken at least half of its bounces, the laser will often reflect back and instantly destroy the trap that fired it. That first packet of damage will just eliminate the Sentry Beam itself. The Flash Barrier, while it can outlast the whole of the duration of a laser shot, unlike the default Arc Barrier, is much less likely to cause self-destruction, just due to the angles involved and the fact that the Flash Barrier is a half-cylinder, or rather a half-sphere, instead of a full sphere. Generally speaking, it will not reflect the Sentry Beam directly back at itself, so much less likely to cause a self-destruct scenario against the Sentry. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of that here. We can grab a Sentry Beam, and we're just going to stick one on this wall over here. And then I'm going to go into test mode, and we are just going to, I've already got an Arc Barrier equipped, take a step here, let the thing aim at us, and you can see the Sentry Beam destroyed itself immediately. So yeah, very hard counter. The Arc Barriers will immediately cause these things to kill themselves under most circumstances. Now, the mods for the Sentry Beam come in at a very reasonable 5 capacity each, which is easily the cheapest in the game for any 50 capacity trap. That's not the worst thing in the world, though, because you're going to want to have at least one of these mods on basically every single Sentry that you place. First off, let's take a look at the Over-Amplify mod here. This causes the beam to deflect off 2 additional surfaces, so it will bounce 2 extra times and then dissipate on the 5th surface struck instead of the 3rd. That makes it much more likely that you're going to get value out of this trap because it has 25 blocks of firing range on it. You are much more likely to hit the bounce cap than you are to hit the range cap. So this brings the bounce cap up to a point where you're much more likely to get at least somewhat close to using the full range of the laser trap, or the Sentry Beam. So yeah, very valuable mod, and one that you want on this thing in most circumstances. The Target Lock mod does not do what the description says. Now, I don't know whether this is a bug or whether it's intended behavior, but the mod does increase the tracking speed a tiny bit, I think, but what it does on top of that is increase the length of the tracking phase to a full 4 3/4 seconds before it transitions to the charging phase. Now this increases the time before the beam actually fires to a full 5.5 seconds. In its current iteration as of the launch of Dreadshore and the recording of this video, therefore, this mod is not great, and I would not recommend it under almost any circumstances. If Target Lock's behavior is changed to match its description, it'll make the Sentry considerably more useful in open spaces, but right now, at least, I can't really recommend that you use this mod because you're basically paying 5 capacity to make its default behavior considerably worse, unless your goal is specifically to make the laser even slower to fire. I could see a couple of use cases here where you might want to have a pair of these working in tandem, one with Target Lock and one without, just to keep a consistent beam of laser firing at the raider over and over and over again, just to keep alternating their firing patterns, if nothing else. The Pinball mod also does not do what the description says, at least as of launch. It's supposed to add a small amount of extra angle to each ricochet bounce. However, the beam appears to deflect about 15 to 20 degrees towards the straight upwards direction, regardless of the angle of the beam that impacted the surface. I've submitted a bug report for this behavior and the target lock behavior, so hopefully this is going to get addressed in a future patch. However, in the meantime, this bounce is very controllable and reliable. Just be prepared in case the developers change the behavior of it at some point in the future. Right now, keep in mind it is going to bounce your beams slightly upwards more than they should. It's not going to widen the beam angle, it's just going to make it go up. The second wave mod is of course the same second wave mod that all other wall traps have. It'll make the trap invisible and invulnerable until the gen mod is picked up, after which it will immediately appear and be destructible, and then undergo an arming phase of about 3.5 seconds, after which it will be ready and available to fire. Now, by itself, on the surface the Sentry looks like a very weak trap, and certainly you're not going to expect it to get kills against any but the most careless of raiders if you just stick one of these out in the open space. The extreme charge time means that raiders often have plenty of time to destroy however many of these you place in a room as well, and their weakness to the arc barrier really cannot be understated, right? One arc barrier cast can destroy 20 of these things if you position them all on a wall where they can see the raider at the same time. So you really have to be careful with these things because they're really not a good primary trap. However, they provide something that previously hasn't really been a factor in Meteor Maker. They provide indirect fire. Now, bomb ejectors and cannon backs can kind of fulfill that role, but it's in a somewhat unpredictable or difficult to control way. If the laser is triggered and not immediately destroyed, however, it will project a death beam, and it will do that in a reliable, repeatable pattern that a good builder can use to their advantage. So therein lies both the strength and weakness of the Sentry. It's a 50 cost trap that absolutely must be used with other trap or guard types to be really effective. By itself, a tiny little sideways step is going to take the raider to safety. You just wait for that flashing locked indicator where it's charging the shot, and then you just take a small sideways step and you're safe. The beam's width is extremely narrow, so it really doesn't present a lot of threat to the raider if you can just, step sideways a little bit and then you're safe. So yeah, they aren't great just in open space by themselves. Or you can take some of that 3 3/4 seconds of charging and prep time to just shoot the Sentry. You can just blow it up, and you'll do so long before it ever fires, no matter how horrible your reaction times are. However, these things are loud, flashy, noisy, and the lethal distance or the amount of area or space that they cover with that beam over that 25 tile range can actually be really a huge threat. So they look nasty and they sound nasty, and that beam itself can be quite nasty. So raiders have a lot of incentive to deal with these things. Or if they don't deal with them, if they underestimate them, then you also have an opportunity there because these things are actually great at catching speedrunners. So yeah, there's a couple different use cases for these in conjunction with other traps that make them very, very effective. So unlike some of my other trap and guard videos, I'm going to walk you through a couple of really key tricks and geometries for the Sentry. Now, most of these operate by restricting the Sentry's field of fire as much as possible, and they force it to do somewhere between 1 and 3 things very specifically. And that makes the Sentry Beam a lot more reliable and repeatable if it's firing into a specific set of geometry. So the trick really here is to make the Sentry Beam useful and make it to where it can't destroy itself easily. And to do that, you're going to have to restrict its firing angle just so that it can't cause as much friendly fire, and you can use it in conjunction with other traps more successfully. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at our first trick here. So the first trick here, this little piece of geometry I've got in front of me, is what I call a Sentry Switch or a binary switch, because it forces the Sentry Beam to do exactly one of 2 things, assuming of course that the raider doesn't destroy it or stand in front of it for whatever reason. So the geometry is pretty simple and really can operate at multiple angles. You can rotate this around in various different directions. You could make it vertical. You could do whatever you need to with it. But it does require this corrosive cube over here to function properly, and its role as a 3-way switch. if this corrosive cube is a solid block, the beam will nearly always bounce off of it instead of going over to this side over here. So what that will do is then bounce the beam off this side and send it off this angle over here, and that will cause the beam to ricochet over here all the time. So what it will do otherwise, and what it's supposed to do, is once the beam notices the radar through this little gap here, if you back away from it this way, the beam will ricochet off this surface and follow you in this direction. Whereas if you run past this over here, the beam will hit this surface instead and ricochet off this way and come following you over here. So no matter which way you try and get away from this thing, the beam will follow you to some degree or another, and it will do so without really exposing the Sentry to the radar for very long at all. So speedrunners won't really get a chance to see that and destroy it very easily, and the beam will follow them over here if I'm running this direction. A cautious raider, if you can distract them with another trap, might trigger the Sentry Beam over here, and then back away once they hear it spooling up, and then get caught by surprise as the beam follows them back over here. There's a couple different tricks and techniques we can use to obscure the beam's path, just to make it a little less clear what it's going to do in the future. But yeah, this is the general premise here. We're using this one beam positioning to do two completely different things based on which direction the radar is going. Another thing of note here is that at least in one of these two directions, we are also controlling the height of the beam. Now, if we go into test mode here, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If I walk up here and convince the beam to fire this way, well, it destroyed itself in this case. Let me go ahead and put in a little piece of geometry so it's not going to do that. It doesn't do us any good to have the trap destroy itself too quickly. Okay, so this is bouncing down, you'll notice. And it's not much of a down angle. It's fairly equal to the height of the radar. It's about waist height all the way across there. And it went down just, a tiny little bit of an angle. It would have been lethal to us trying to walk forward, basically out to the entire range of the beam. On the other side, however, if we just run past this, you can see that this beam still reflects in a useful direction here, but you can see it's angled down much further. And that's because on this other side over here, we don't have anything like this V to control where the beam is aiming. Naturally, a Sentry Beam's lens is positioned halfway up the block, and the radar's center of mass is well below halfway up a block. If I stand next to this block, you can see that my head is barely half the height of the block, and as a result, when the Sentry Beam aims at my center of mass, it is aiming downwards slightly. So that's not necessarily the greatest thing in the world, because that beam heading down means it's going to use one of its bounces just ricocheting off the floor, and the beam is relatively easy to just jump over. So it's not much of a threat, or not as much of a threat, going in that direction. So consider when you have a geometry like this, making the radar go down a slope, just so that the beam remains at a more useful height throughout its extent. The reason that this works in the opposite direction without doing this, of course, is that we have that V-shaped geometry back there, right? That means that the last point of us that the Sentry Beam is able to see is higher up. It's closer towards that lens. So it's going to aim more upwards as it's tracking us as far as it can. It will fire towards the last possible position that it saw us at. And so it's going to, in this case, see a little bit of us at that higher height as we walk past in this direction. So it will stay higher for longer. It's not perfect, but generally speaking, that makes the beam a lot more controllable and a lot more reliable in that one specific direction. Another arrangement of blocks and geometry here, based on this same concept, was suggested at first by a user we've actually had run one of our previous maps here, Karstocles. And basically what this does is this is a three-way switch, and it's a very interesting three-way switch. Basically what this does is if I am coming up from the bottom here, the laser will see me when I reach this block right around here. And if I jump up to this block up here, the laser will actually bounce off of the underside of it, hit this block, and then reflect up and over. Up here, rather. Whereas if I am up here, or rather, if I step up here and then retreat back down, the laser will center itself along this little V groove here, And what that will do is it will impact right at the center there. That will bounce up here. That will impact right at the center of that block, right at the center of this one, and then right at the center of this one, and then bounce all the way out here. And now it's out of bounces at that point, but it's still got plenty of life left in the beam length. So if you have a narrow hallway coming in there, you can use that to your advantage. But yeah, it's actually quite consistent and reliable that the beam will bounce really straight out there. It won't really go down for the floor or up for the ceiling. It's actually very consistent in its aim. However, there's even a third function to this, because if I crest this hill over here and I'm just running past, what this will do is the Sentry Beam will see that it's the last possible point that it could aim at me is right about here, and it will aim at my head here, which happens to be this block right here. So what it's going to do is bounce off this block, and then proceed forward, following me straight out this pathway. So this particular arrangement is actually three-function. It can aim the beam up, back, and bounce it around in this area if the raider jumps up here, or it can aim the beam back down this way and bounce it all the way back out there if the raider attempts to retreat, or if the raider attempts to run forward, it will actually bounce it all the way out here, and it will do so with a couple of remaining bounces if I've got the bounce mod on there, which I basically have to have in order to get the other functionality. So yeah, in essence, this is a three-way switch mounted into a vertical area that actually protects the Sentry Beam much better than most other arrangements would. So this particular case over here is especially interesting to me. Now, this does need to be a pretty narrow walkway. Normally I would have walls on either side of the walkway here, but generally speaking, this can be used in a variety of circumstances. It's just a little more finicky the more open you make the area. So take that under advisement. Maybe you can come up with your own ideas based off this concept that do even more interesting things or do them better than I've been able to envision here. Now, the second trick I'd like to talk about here is obscuring the firing line of the beam. This is a little tricky to do, but generally speaking, you can take an impaler, and you do have to force a raider to cross this impaler, so it's generally most useful against speedrunners. This is not really going to catch your slow raiders much. They're just going to destroy the impaler. However, what you can do here is take the blockade mod on the impaler, and you just apply that mod to the impaler, and then we're going to test this out. Now, normally when you run past the Sentry Beam here, it would reflect off this side over here, and then the beam would go out in this direction. We've seen that before, we know how that works. But we would see it coming, right? The beam would be very obvious, the intended path of the beam would be immediately apparent, and there's really not a whole way of obscuring it. However, if you can cause a trap to obscure the line of the Sentry Beam, that makes it a lot less predictable, and you can catch some speedrunners unaware with that. So, right now, you can see as soon as those impalers extend, you can't see the line of the laser. Now, it still exists, it still bounces, it still does exactly what you need it to, but the impaler gets destroyed the moment the beam goes off, and you don't get the opportunity to really see the beam until it has already destroyed the impaler and is dealing damage. Now, unfortunately, slow raiders are a much harder target for this kind of trick. They're just going to destroy that impaler because it's actually a threat to them, and then they're just going to waltz across there. They won't. They'll either destroy the Sentry Beam or just generally will ignore the whole trap setup. In general, you're going to have a much harder time catching them with that hidden, obscured beam trick. But you can kind of sort of do something. If you have this thing go through a corrosive cube there and reflect off this, and then you could have a blockade piston here and then reflect off there and then back out into a hallway, you could technically make it do something, but over here, if we have this arrangement, we cannot use overamplify on the Sentry Beam, so we can't bounce it any further than we already have. If I go over here and do this as an example, you'll see that when the piston extends, the bounce beam actually goes back and immediately destroys the Sentry Beam, because that first tick of damage actually does bounce off the death piston and reflect all the way back over and destroy the Sentry Beam. In order to avoid that, we have to go down to the default 2 bounces, because what it's going to do there is bounce once, bounce twice, and then it will dissipate on this reflected angle here. So technically we can still do this, we just need to lower the number of bounces, and that makes the trap generally just less effective overall. You can see here, well, that's particularly poor timing, but did we end up destroying the piston? It sounds like we did. Yeah. So the piston interrupted the beam there and did not actually end up destroying the Sentry Beam. So yeah, you can see that actually did work there. It didn't actually manage to interrupt the laser. I was able to see that very clearly. So again, you can see this is less reliable. It's 65 cost instead of 40. Just your best bet is not to use this trick. The next trick I'd like to talk about is what I'd call remote control. You can have the laser beam, of course, destroy hollow cubes on contact, so it can be used as part of a clever arrangement to catch the raider off guard. If you can control the path of the beam precisely enough to reliably pop hollow cubes, you can cause traps to be unexpectedly exposed, or you can have it pop a masquerade hollow cube and drop a dead man's switch guard in, or even just drop live guards in on the raider's pathway, get an unexpected surround off on the raider. So I've got an example of that here. We've got the Sentry Beam over there, we've got the standard splitter arrangement, but instead of trying to direct the beam forward, I've directed it up, and then had it travel forwards through this corrosive cube. And you'll be able to see the results here. I can walk through this, and then a dead man's switch guard will drop out of the roof. With no other interaction required on my part, I have not popped a hollow cube. I haven't done anything there. Now obviously this isn't particularly useful by itself, I literally just walked past that. But you can imagine having done that over a much, much longer range, and timing it so that the DMS guard drops in right as the raider is passing. That could be very effective for slowing down or stopping speedrunners. Additionally, Sentry Beams, kind of like Plasma Sentinels, make perfect ammo traps for Volt Lancer raiders. Raiders really have a lot of incentive to shoot them. They're loud, they're noisy, they're flashy, and they're threatening in really much the same way as the Plasma Sentinels, but they're a bit cheaper than Sentinels, and they can be used to fire around more corners. So really the Sentry Beam is in effect a better method than the Plasma Sentinel at forcing the raider backwards through pathways. So really the raider has a lot of incentive to kill these things, especially if they're in an open room firing into an enclosed hallway that the raider has to start in. Either the raider goes into the room and has to deal with everything in the room, or they try and back away, and if they try and back away, these things are going to fire a beam that will follow the raider some distance. So really the raider has a lot of incentive to shoot them. So they make really good ammo traps, but there are a couple of weaknesses for that. If a player or raider is running the Volt Lancer and Arc Barrier, they're just going to drop an Arc Barrier down, and it's going to immediately destroy all three of these things, so not necessarily what you want there. Your best bet to counter that is just to force the raider to absolutely require them to use their shield either as they go into the room, or just in some way force them to use the shield or consider other weapon sets. Having a lot of guards in the room might encourage them to consider the use of the plasma crossbow instead of the arc barrier, or just, a variety of other techniques just to make sure that they can't sit there and easily shield the shots from these things and destroy all three traps as a result. Now lastly, I'd like to talk about combining these laser splitters with other traps, and just the, in general, combining the Sentry Beam or Sentry Splitter with other traps. Now, as you've noticed, both of these combinations here, or rather these kind of geometries and reflective surfaces, require a corrosive cube in them to work effectively. And you can make use of that, right? These Sentry Beams are obviously not going to do well on their own. The raider can, in this case, just walk up to the thing and shoot it. They've got 3.5 seconds to shoot it before the thing goes off. Likewise up here, even if you don't know where the Sentry Beam is, you probably have enough time to locate and destroy it. Now, if you have plenty of time to locate and destroy the Sentry Beam, then this isn't an effective trap sequence. However, if you combine this with other traps in here, like put a Deadman Switch cannon back on this particular slope block over here, if the raider is coming from this way, the cannonback will fire down that slope. If he's coming from up here and tries to back away, the cannonback will fire down this slope. If the raider retreats all the way back down here, he'll get caught by the beam. If they try and jump up here and kill the cannonback in melee, it might be able to trap a cannonball in there, or they might get hit by the laser reflecting around up in here, or they might just kill the Dead Man's Switch guard up here, and then, you know, it won't be able to roll down the slope cleanly and it'll explode under them and kill them. So there's a lot of different things you could do with that that combine that very successfully with other simple traps. They don't need to be expensive. You don't need to spend all your capacity in one place, but generally speaking, you'll be able to combine the Sentry Beams much more effectively with other traps than you will with other Sentry Beams. So these geometries tend to lend themselves very well, especially to bomb splitters. The corrosive cube positioning here tends to be great if you have a bomb splitter or something like a homing dart trap, or bolt shot, I should say. And those in general will be an excellent way of forcing the raider to deal with multiple threats at the same time. And that draws attention away from the Sentry Beam, that allows it to do its thing, and the Sentry Beam itself will add a lot of pressure to an already dangerous situation for the raider. So the Sentry Beam, while it might be a support trap, often will dictate the architecture of the room, and then the architecture of the room will often inform what other traps are going to be effective given the constraints that are placed on the builder. So yeah, you can kind of play off of each other here. The Sentry Beam might dictate the shape of the room, but the shape of the room, on the other hand, might create several new interesting opportunities for traps that you wouldn't have otherwise considered. So yeah, don't be too stubborn about forcing the Sentry Beams into an existing room, or about using a Sentry Beam in a room that doesn't need it. Sometimes the Sentry Beam just doesn't add to a scenario, so don't use it there. These are not a primary killing trap, and shouldn't be used as such. Another interesting combination here is that lasers force you to move, even if only slightly. Having a Ravager positioned in such a way that it can't move will force the Ravager to fire at the raider, as we'll discuss in our next tutorial video, but at more than a couple of blocks of distance, the Ravager will generally miss slightly to both the left and right of the raider. You can pair the Ravager with an Enforcer to force the raider to move, but a laser can accomplish much the same thing and won't be as vulnerable to the Plasma Bow. Obviously, other traps can also do the same thing, so the usefulness of this can be debated, but generally speaking, forcing the raider to move when they're dealing with Ravagers is a good thing. Cannonbacks also pair naturally with this thing, because the movement needed to avoid a laser very often will put the raider in range of a cannonball explosion, or the movement needed to avoid the cannonball explosion will put the raider right where the laser's going. So those things tend to pair naturally quite well together, I've found. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll come back next time, where we'll be looking at the new guard introduced in Dreadshore, the Ravager.